Scott Thornaby is. Can you, Scott, please start the panels if you want, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, you do it again.
We would sit down. Wait for our distinguished fellow colleagues to be. Amanda, this is the thing. So it's just forward and back, and just ignore that one.
That one there to go forward.
Yeah,
Okay.
and you'll see the screen
and
there, and then just head it up towards the box up there. It seems to be was working. We can't test it at the moment, but when they put the thing up, we could try. So I'll leave it with you, because I don't need it. Guard it with your life, and then give it back to me. Anywhere you like.
Good morning. I haven't had a chance to talk to you about the conversation.
We may not have that little screen. No.
Oh, really? And then turn around and...
Yeah. Yeah, working on it. We finish at 11, right?
Yeah, no, 10:45.
10:45.
Do you want to open the day, or do you want me to find something? You already opened the day? Okay, so when you tell us when to begin.
He's fixing the screen. هتصلح ولا لا؟ ايه؟ والله شو؟
This is one? Yes. Conference in Tunisia, nice little folder they gave us. I've kept it ever since. We can live without it. So. seem to have a screen, so you'll have to swivel around. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. Sabah al khair. Good morning. This is the panel that focuses on professional development, teacher training, in English language teaching. And I have an illustrious array of experts in the field. I'll just introduce them. On the right here, you know Jeremy Harma, who's a writer of methodology, lecturer at the New School in New York, and a teacher educator and a celebrity and musician. Next to him, we have Amanda Ingram, the Deputy Director of the British Council in Saudi Arabia. Welcome, Amanda. Next to Amanda, we have Tim Banks, who's the Global Manager of Teacher Development for Cambridge Assessment. Welcome, Tim. And next to Tim, we have Peter Watkins, teacher educator, professor at the University of Portsmouth, writer of methodology books, including a book that he co-wrote with me, or I co-wrote with him. And finally, you all know Patrick Boylan, who's the head of development and support and professional development unit at the King Abdulaziz University, where we are. Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for coming along. A round of applause for our illustrious guests. So the theme is teacher development, teacher education, and each of the guests is going to speak for 10 minutes to the subject, and then we will throw it open for questions from the floor or further questions that I have for the guests. We're due to finish at 11:15. Let's see how we go. So thank you again for attending, and I'll now hand over to Amanda Ingram, who, as I said, is the Deputy Director of the British Council here in Saudi Arabia. Amanda, it's all yours.
Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here, and it's especially lovely to be in the section on professional development for teachers. As Deputy Director here at the British Council in Saudi Arabia, my work now isn't entirely classroom focused. I work across the range of activities in arts, culture, sport, and education. But I've spent 20 years either as a teacher, as a teacher trainer, as a manager of teaching centres, and teacher development is absolutely dear to my heart. And once a teacher, always a teacher. And I just love everything about teachers and teaching. So we're here to talk about teacher development and how that is the driving force behind learner attainment. And why is that important? Let's see if the clicker works. It does. It is really important. It matters a lot, particularly here in Saudi Arabia today. Education underpins basically every aspect of Vision 2030 and transforming Saudi Arabia into a knowledge-based economy, and fostering the creativity and the innovation for technological and societal development. And within education, English language skills are absolutely critical. So what we're all here for over these few days is critical to that. So many aspects of Vision 2030 depend on English language skills and supporting graduates to leave with employer ready. Education also matters very deeply to the British Council in supporting our cultural relations mission to build more inclusive and open societies and open opportunities for young people. And the priority of education is absolutely recognised. 193 billion SAR, about 40 billion pounds on the education for 2020. That's the largest single aspect of the budget. And within education, why professional development for teachers? Why is that so important? Well, to use the words from the UNESCO Learning Generation, innovation in strengthening and expanding a diverse education workforce is critical to improving education. So it really matters, and teachers are really important, and the professional development of teachers are really important. Well, is there a real, well, it's not just about the teacher, is it? It can't just be down to you, the outcomes of learners. There are lots of other factors as well which influence learner attainment. We all know that student characteristics, the environment, the resources available, the leadership within the educational institute have a huge impact. But the largest effect on learning, which we can influence, is teacher effectiveness. So, no pressure. The outcomes of Vision 2030, 193 billion SAR, no pressure on you, but you are the single biggest factor that is going to influence the outcomes, the learning outcomes of your students. And is there a huge variance between teachers? Are some teachers much more effective than others? Or are they all about the same? There is tremendous variance in teacher quality. Tremendous variance. Now, this might be a bit of an uncomfortable thing to say, but there's evidence to support that. Studies with 50 teachers showed that students working with the most effective teacher of those 50 were able to learn in 6 months what it took students with the average teacher to learn in a year. So the most effective teachers are twice as effective, twice as good. And the reverse is true as well. The students studying with the least effective teacher from that group of 50, it took them 2 years to assimilate the material that with the average teacher was just 1 year. So yeah, it varies a lot, and some teachers are more effective than others, twice as good or twice as bad. And it's also about the most effective teachers are able in their classrooms to actually get students from disadvantaged backgrounds achieving as much as students from advantaged backgrounds. So that inclusion theme coming through there as well. So how can we be more effective? Is it about how long we've been teaching? We get better and better and more effective each year. I don't know how long you've been teaching, or if anybody's willing to put their hands up. Anybody been teaching for less than 3 years? Less than 10 years? More than 10 years? It must be everybody else. Okay. So, are you at your most effective now? Have you reached your peak? I'm going to show you a graph. Not a great graph, in the sense that what it's basically saying is that the impact that a teacher has, whereas we would hope that impact would continue to go up and up and up year after year with the more experience that you have, actually seems to grind to a halt after the first couple of years teaching. So it seems from some of these studies that those first couple of years, really challenging years when you begin teaching, difficult years, are actually when perhaps we grow the most, and there is a very real danger of just not really developing that much beyond that. So how can we tackle that? What can we do to move that slope on an upward trajectory again. I'll talk in a lot more detail about some of these things at the end of the day in a session. But I think, professional development for teachers is clearly one of the things that you can do, if you do it right, that can help move people back up on the upward direction. There are other things you can do. Simulate those first few incredibly challenging years. That's something I personally did in my teaching career by changing countries every couple of years and throwing myself in at the deep end. Completely different cultures, different levels, different teaching environments. When you take a step change, when you do a delta, for example, you thought before that you were pretty good, you knew what you were doing, and then suddenly you get the delta dip and you question everything that you're doing. So it's not just how long you've been teaching, it's what you do in that period. And there are lots of different types of professional development, and they have varying degrees of success and outcomes. So kind of going from the studying the theory, which, to be honest, doesn't seem to be that effective, a little bit better if you see a demonstration or modeling of it. And then we really only start to see real outcomes in learner attainment and engagement when you are practicing these ideas. And the best, peer coaching. So if you can work with other teachers and experiment with your professional development, discuss with them, reiterate it afterwards. What worked well, what didn't, how's it going, why is this not working, what do you think? The more discussion and experimentation you can have with your colleagues, the more effective your professional development will be, and the more impact it will have on your learners. What does good continuing professional development look like? There's lots of research on this and lots of themes coming through, which I will explore more later in the day. But some of the typical things that come up frequently. It needs to be concrete and it needs to be classroom-based. Now that poses challenges in a new digital world. How do you make everything classroom-based? But if at the end of the day, you can define different types of classroom as well. But there has to be practice. Teachers need to collaborate with each other on professional development. You can't do it in isolation. You need to engage with expertise, not just within your own institute, but outside of that as well. And really important, you as the teacher, you need to be involved in empowering your own professional development. There's a partnership between the institution, the needs of that institution and the environment it's in, and the teachers and the learners, but the teacher themselves has to be a critical factor in this. Mentoring and coaching, part of the discussion and experimentation, and sustained over time. One-shot CPD doesn't work. You've seen forgetting graphs when you're thinking about vocabulary recycling with your students. It's no good just to see it once, to try it once. In fact, studies show that you pick up a new tool or technique or idea from a conference like this. On Sunday, when you go back into class, you might try it once. Maybe you'll try it again, and that won't be enough. You need to try it 20 to 25 times to really embed it into your teaching practice. You do need the support of the leadership in your institution. And this is a framework for continual professional development from the British Council. It looks at 12, I don't expect you to be able to read all the details on this, but it looks at sort of 12 key professional practices for teachers covering skills and knowledge. It's not meant to be entirely exhaustive because we are working in a developing and changing environment in education, but it's pretty comprehensive and covers a lot of the areas. And the idea is that you as an individual teacher can go in and assess yourself against these various professional practices and give yourself a score. There's a needs analysis tool to help you do that. And that can help you identify areas that you can focus on in your own professional development. Of course, one of the interesting things with any self-assessment tool for teachers on their professional competencies, it depends a little bit where you're at in teaching. You don't know what you don't know. So, I sometimes find that very experienced teachers score themselves quite badly because they're aware of, how much there is out there that they don't know or how they're not perfect. Whereas maybe less experienced teachers give themselves, higher scores. But this is something that isn't to be shared with anybody. You can just keep it for yourself. And that can help you, I think, guide you towards specific opportunities for professional development that could have the most meaningful impact for you and which could translate into you being a more effective teacher and your students' learning outcomes increasing and them achieving their objectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for that very clear overview of the terrain. And it seems appropriate to follow on now with Tim Banks, who, as I said before, is the Global Manager of Teacher Development at Cambridge Assessment, the man from CELTA and Delta. Yes. Thank you, Tim.
So, good morning. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to Patrick and the English Language Institute for arranging the conference and all the fantastic arrangements that they've prepared for us here. There we go. So, I'm going to, in my 10 minutes, I'm going to continue talking on very similar themes to what Amanda has started with this morning. So some of this you'll have heard already, but I'll take it in a slightly different angle. And my idea here is that professional development for teachers is necessary to improve learning outcomes for our learners. We don't do professional development for teachers only for the benefit of teachers, we do it for the benefit of learners. So the whole purpose is to ensure that students are coming out with a better standard of English at the end of their education. So it works, but, and there's a big but there, which I'll come to in a moment. So as Scott says, my name's Tim Banks. I'm the Global Manager for Teacher Development at Cambridge English, so I'm responsible for all of our teacher courses and qualifications. So, what's the but that comes after this? Before I go on to the but, I'll hold that back for a moment. Again, going back to what Amanda mentioned earlier about why teacher development is important. If you have a look at this quote, I'll give you a second to read that. Perhaps needs a tiny bit of explanation. So what it's arguing, I think, is that there are many different variables that affect what students learn and how quickly, how well they can learn in any subject. Variables, the biggest variable being their own aptitude for learning before they come to the school. So how good are they at learning a language, in our case? And lots of other variables about their motivation, for instance, which are also, of course, crucial. Most of these, as educators, even as leaders of educational institutions, we can't really affect. So there's not that much we can do to influence a lot of those things. Of the things that we can influence, the things where we have a role to play, teacher quality is the most important. So teacher quality from this research is shown to be more important than other variables such as class size, for example, or even the learning materials that are used in the classroom. So teacher quality is a vital ingredient in helping our students to learn better English. How do we improve teacher quality? There are various ways that people have tried to address teacher quality, such as the criteria for people entering the profession, making it more difficult, restricting who can enter teaching. For most countries, that's not realistic. There's a shortage of teachers. There are not enough people going into teacher training anyway. So perhaps the biggest way that we can influence teacher quality is through professional development for our teachers. So, coming on to the but. It's not a quick, easy fix. It would be lovely to be able to say this is what you do and it will work and everything will be fantastic and rosy, but it's just not true. Millions of dollars have been spent on teacher development programs all over the world in many different countries, which have proved not to be as effective as they were intended. Not always, of course. There are many others where positive impact has been achieved. But what do we need? I've broken this down into a few key themes about what we need to put into programs that will be effective. First one, I'd say it needs to be planned, by which I mean it needs to be structured. So it needs to be a very strategically planned and structured program to achieve change in a larger scale institution or program. So at the level of an education authority, a university, a Ministry of Education, it needs to be a very well planned, well thought out and resourced program. So resourcing a key part of this. It needs to be focused. So it should be clearly aligned with the needs of learners in terms of achieving better learning outcomes for the learners, but it also needs to be focused on practical classroom skills. So it's about what teachers are actually doing in the classroom, so that it's directly relevant to the teachers. It needs to be ongoing. Again, as I think Amanda mentioned earlier, short-term workshops rarely have much impact unless they have a very limited and specific aim. A single workshop is not going to achieve significant change in people's practice. It needs to be a program which is coherent, which is built around a theme aligned to the goals. And finally, the role of leadership is also crucial. So it needs to be very well led at all levels, from the highest educational leadership down to the school level and individual teachers themselves. But the leadership is crucial in establishing the right kind of culture, a collaborative culture where people are supporting each other in their development. So, some context around this from Vision 2030 talks a lot about developments in education, supporting developments in education. Again, as Amanda mentioned, a huge investment in education, which is fantastic. Shows it's clearly the right time for us to be talking about how we help teachers in their development. And particularly around higher education, I think these two quotes show us a couple of things. For one thing, Saudi students are going to be taught English. They're expected to learn their English here in the kingdom, in places like the English Language Institute at King Abdulaziz and others. They're not going to be sent overseas to learn English in the same way as has been the case in the past. And similarly, there'll be more teaching of subjects in English in universities in Saudi Arabia. These suggest two things to me. One, the students need to be coming out of schools with a better level of English, so they're better prepared to go into university English language programs and into undergraduate courses that are taught in English. And also, the teachers of subjects in English need to be at an appropriate level. So both the teachers of English and the teachers of other subjects in English. So there's a lot of key themes around English coming from Vision 2030. Now, I represent Cambridge, and our approach to teacher development is very much collaborative. So we're very much keen to work with institutions at all levels, to work together to help you identify your goals, identify your needs, and develop a program that works well for you and with our support. And I think a crucial factor in any teacher development intervention is that it should build local capacity. Programs which rely on bringing in foreign experts or experts from outside don't tend to work so well. They're usually very expensive, they're unsustainable, so they fall down after a couple of years. They may have some impact, but they don't go on and have the longevity that you really need. Another key consideration is that they need to build on teachers' existing practice and knowledge. So if you start to tell teachers that what they're doing now is no good, they need to change, they need to adapt to some international standard, it tends not to go down very well for obvious reasons. So any program needs to take into consideration where teachers are now, what their previous training is, what their experience is, to learn from that and enable them to build on it. So to help them to develop themselves and to involve them in the planning of their development as well. And finally, measuring impact. If you want to see that you've achieved your goals, you need to know where you are at the beginning. So some form of study to identify a baseline where teachers are now in their performance, in their skills, and then after or during the program of teacher development to measure what impact has been made so that you're able to show that your investment has achieved what you set out to do. So from Cambridge we're able to offer a fairly integrated solution. Teacher development obviously is only one part of an intervention across the whole education system. Other important areas, consultancy across curricula, etc. Assessment to measure teacher and student achievement, teacher development, and of course learning materials from my colleagues from Cambridge University Press. So altogether they make for an integrated solution which can address these needs. And in terms of the specifics of teacher development, we offer a range of courses that can help to build a program, which are differentiated by the type of students that are involved. So for example, in higher education, you may well be familiar with programs like the CELTA and Delta, which are primarily for teachers who are working with adult learners, so very suitable for higher education institutions. And if your students have been studying in the UK, for example, in many other countries, their teachers will almost certainly have CELTA and Delta as their qualification. And the EMI Skills course is a course for teachers of other subjects in English. So again, very relevant for higher education. And for schools, we offer a range of courses and qualifications, again, like the CELT-P and CELT-S, the Certificate in English Language Teaching for primary and secondary, which address the needs specifically of teachers in compulsory education. But I would argue that these kind of courses and qualifications are fantastic. They're a very good part of a teacher's development. They offer a very structured program, but they're still only the building blocks of a full CPD program for teachers. On their own, they're part of a solution, but they're not the whole solution. The whole solution needs to involve other elements such as coaching, mentoring, peer observation, which continue throughout the career of the teacher. And very often, those kind of elements are the ones which are easier to implement in many ways and more cost effective. but they're often neglected as well. So finally, to come back to my main point, professional development for teachers is vital, it is effective, but it needs to address these concerns and considerations if it's going to have the impact that we want it to. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Peter Watkins from the University of Portsmouth, who's going to talk to you about reading.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to the conference and for the incredible hospitality that we've been shown since we've been here as visiting speakers. I'm going to talk a little bit about teacher development and teacher education, but to start with, I'd like to just think about what that actually involves for most teachers. For most teachers, what do we see as teacher education consisting of? What is it? And although we could talk a lot about the detail of that, I think there are two key elements to it for most teachers. I think for most teachers, teacher education is about learning new ways of doing things, different ways of doing things. So rather than, just to take a sort of simple example, rather than having 2 ways of practicing vocabulary with our learners, we have 10 ways of practicing vocabulary. So we build on our repertoire of the ways in which we do things. I think that's one element of teacher development. But that's not enough, I don't think, for teachers. Teachers also need to develop an understanding and an awareness of what particular activity or method will work best in a particular situation with a particular group of learners in a particular classroom. So teachers also need to develop an awareness of what activity to use. The understanding principle of the activity will hopefully lead to better decision making by teachers. So I think that's really what teacher development is. It's about finding new ways of doing things and making more informed choices about when to use each thing. So when thinking about, well, how do teachers go about developing then? How can teachers do that? Well, that's quite difficult to say because teachers work in a variety of situations. Some teachers have very well developed, very rewarding development programs provided for them. But many teachers would see themselves as working more or less on their own. They're quite isolated. So what can we do for those teachers? How can we help those teachers to develop? And as we go through, well, is it too early to say the middle of the 21st century? I don't know, but we're sort of not at the beginning of the 21st century anymore. It's very tempting to see technology as always being the answer. So whatever we need to do, look to technology. But actually, why I called this bit of the talk, bit of the session, Back to the Future, is because I turned to quite a tried and trusted method of teacher development, something which has served teachers very well for generations. And so the way of teacher development I would sort of recommend is this. Would be reading. I think teachers reading about teaching is a really, really good way of them developing their professional practice. Why would reading actually be good for teachers? Well, for one thing, reading is hugely flexible. Wherever you are in your career, whether you're a new teacher or an experienced teacher, whether you want to develop that practical side of teaching, of new ways of doing things, or whether you want to understand more about theory and why things might work in a classroom, well, there'll be something for you to read. Reading is hugely flexible. But perhaps more importantly, I think reading is, by its very nature, a slow, reflective thing to do. as we read, what we do is take new information from a text, but fit it into what we already know. So we're forced to reflect on our practice. So I think reading about teaching is a way of being really thoughtful and reflective. And good writing, so what we read, if it's written well, should be evidence-based. Now, sometimes writers don't explicitly cite the evidence, sometimes they don't explicitly give the evidence, but hopefully people who write about teaching are basing what they write on evidence. And I cannot stress too strongly that I think teachers need to be making evidence-based decisions, not purely relying on intuition. We need to also look at the evidence that there is for certain practices and examine it very critically. Amanda was talking about collaboration and the need for teachers to collaborate in their development, which is a really good point. But reading doesn't have to be a sort of it's solely individual practice. It's very easy to conceive of a teacher development program which would consist of teachers agreeing on a text to read, reading it, and then coming together to discuss what it means for them and ideas surrounding the text, so that those ideas can be co-constructed and developed with the help of colleagues. So reading can actually be a terrific prompt for collaborative teacher development. And I would also argue that reading is a very motivating thing for teachers. And I think it's motivating because it can be so autonomous. Whatever area of understanding we want to develop, we can find something to read about it. Let me just give you one example of a teacher I was working with very recently who wanted to develop an understanding of special educational needs in English language teaching. Now, within a short space of time, by reading the literature available on that, she felt she had developed some kind of expertise, and what's more, she was in control of the direction of her professional development, which was hugely motivating to her. And she's now going to give a sort of talk at a conference on that. So this is a really motivating way of developing as a teacher. I know that the obvious question that I guess you would ask me is, what should we read? Okay, what should we read? Well, that's an impossible question to answer because in a way it should be coming from you. What do you want to read? What are you interested in? But having said that, I am being sponsored by Cambridge University Press, so I am going to put in a shameless plug for a particular series of titles. Now, I love this series of titles because it embodies what I think is so useful for teachers. The texts involve reviewing the literature, the evidence for something, reviewing the evidence, and then looking at the classroom implications of that evidence. And all the titles are free on the Cambridge website if you just Google Cambridge papers in ELT. Here are just some of the titles. One of these was written by Scott, by the way, so I'll leave you to guess which one was Scott's. But I'll pause longer on it so that you can see it. And this is just a selection. There are lots and lots and lots of titles in the series. It's really just, I'm using these as an example because I think they're great examples of evidence-based teacher development where you look at the literature and you look at the implications of that literature. Oh, sorry, there was another one. I didn't realize that. But just like we would tell our learners that they must read critically, we must also read critically. As teachers, we need to read critically. And we need to think about, do we trust the evidence that's being put forward? How strong is the evidence? And above all, we need to ask ourselves, would this approach, would these activities work with our learners in our classrooms? However, on that last point, would it work in my class? Let's not set the bar too high. If we think it might work, maybe it's worth experimenting with and trying out and learning from that experience. So, to sum up, reading isn't a new thing. It's quite a traditional thing, but I think it's also a massively empowering thing for teachers to read about teaching. So, thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you, Peter. And that sort of segues nicely into the next speaker, who's perhaps one of the best known writers of reading texts about teaching. I think there's probably not a person in this room who hasn't read a text by Jeremy Harma. So I'll hand over to Jeremy, who's speaking without a PowerPoint.
Thank you very much. Salam alaikum. Good morning, everybody. I want you to imagine that we are not in Jeddah and we're not in this beautiful hall. I want to take you to Woodstock, New York, to a hall called the Maverick Hall. The date, August the 29th, 1952. On the stage is not this wonderful collection of incredible people, but a beautiful grand piano with the lid up, sparkling in the light. And the lid covering the keys is down. I'll tell you why in a minute. The audience is sitting there excited, waiting for a new work of music which they've read about. It's very exciting. Walking onto the stage is a man called David Tudor, a famous pianist. The excitement in the room is amazing. He sits down at the piano. Silence. He opens the lid above the keys. And then he does nothing. He just sits there. And the audience are going, what the? About a minute and a half later, he closes the lid. And then he opens it again, and the audience go, at last, something's going to happen. And he sits there and does nothing. And now the audience is saying, I'm getting angry. I paid a lot of money for this concert. What's going on? And about 2 minutes later, he lifts the lid again, and once again he sits there and does nothing. And after he's done this for a little bit, he stands up and he goes, and the audience kind of go, what? Now, this is a very famous moment in the history of Western classical music. The piece of music is called 4 minutes, 33 seconds. And it's famous. And it was written by a man called John Cage, a famous composer. And some of the audience were really mad, you know, they were really cross. What's this all about? But he said, why did I write this piece? Because it's clearly the music, there is no music, but there are instructions for the performer. He said, the audience who were angry, they missed the point. There's no such thing as silence. What they thought was silence, because they didn't know how to listen, was full of accidental sounds. You could hear the wind stirring outside during the first movement. During the second, you heard rain beginning to patter on the roof. And during the third, the people themselves made all kinds of interesting sounds as they talked or walked out. In other words, his point was that silence matters, because when we are silent, we hear different things. 12 days ago, I was leading a CPD teacher development workshop in the city of São Paulo in Brazil. And the topic that we were discussing, that came up in discussion, was critical thinking. And we all talk about critical thinking lots these days. And one of the teachers there, who I think had been listening to Peter, even though she may never have met Peter, but she must have met you somewhere, she said, no, the most important critical thinking you ever do is when you read. When you read something, whether it's a teacher's book written by Scott or you or anybody else, when you read something, it's the silence when you finish reading that is the most important thing. That's when you think. That's when you try and work out how you feel about what you've just read. When you read something, you don't instantly start talking about it. You think about it. And if you do what Peter was suggesting to us, you do it critically. And yet, when you go to a conference and someone gives a big talk that everybody listens to and the speaker finishes speaking, what do? We get up and we leave. And we start talking to people. Now, if you're lucky, we talk about the talk. What did you think of the talk? But what we mostly do is we run for coffee. And yet what we probably should do is exactly what Peter suggested, which is to sit there for a little bit and think about what we've heard. And maybe it gets worse than that. Funnily enough, Tessa Woodward, one of our colleagues who many of us know, has written about this in an article in which she talks about thinking, critical thinking, because it's a topic that everyone likes talking about. And Tessa says, actually, the most important thinking, perhaps, that people do is not the result of some incredible questions or techniques or anything else like that. It's when you ask students a question and you give them wait time to think about their answer. What I love about coming to conferences and meeting colleagues for the first time for, say, quite a few weeks or a few months, sometimes a few years, is the way in which conversations suddenly seem to meet together and match together. So on the bus, on the first day of the pre-conference event, we were heading back to the hotel, and I was having a conversation with Brian Tomlinson, and we have known each other for many years, and we meet at various occasions and things like that. And he said, what are you going to talk about in the panel? So I said, I'm going to talk about silence. And he said, he said, I had a doctoral student in Vietnam called Bo Dat who got involved in precisely this issue. And what was he interested in? Well, here's the thing we do as teachers. We say, okay, I want you to give me an answer. Tell me what you think of this. And I insist that you answer me immediately. The result? You probably make a complete mess of it. Because if I ask you for instant production, you will probably not be able to think quickly enough, or you'll panic, or you'll feel upset or unhappy or anything else like that. And so your response is going to be a mistake. But if, on the contrary, I say to you, now what do you think about this? I'll give you 15, 30 seconds to wait about it. What do you do? Well, in your head, you think about what you're going to say. And when you think about what you're going to say, you're practicing English. And it's the best practice you will ever do, because you're going through everything you know in your brain to try and work out what to say. And then, when you answer, maybe you get it right, because you've had a chance to practice. Now, according to Brian, and I haven't read Bodat's research and his doctoral thesis, he found in his research that when teachers didn't wait, students screwed up. Please correct me, Brian, if I'm getting this wrong. But when the teacher did wait, they improved significantly. Is that a rough summary of what he said?
He worded it as they overcame their reticence.
Oh, isn't that interesting? He worded it as the students overcame their reticence. And that makes me think of a conversation I had outside yesterday where someone said, what do I do? My students don't want to speak. And you're all familiar with that. Everyone on this platform and everyone in the room knows what it's like when students don't want to speak. Well, one of the things you do is you give them time to think what to say. And it's not just that. We all have our inner voice. We all Imagine that you were married and that you have a disagreement with your husband or your wife. What do you do when the argument is finished? You think about it. You play the argument in your head, and then you come up with the line you should have used. And you go, boom, I won. You do it in your head. We do it all the time. Silence. Silence. Give us time to be silent. And all the wonderful teacher training that we do, we never give our trainees, our developing teachers, time to be silent. I read an article many years ago. I'm sure I'm running out of time. You must tell me if I read an article many years ago by a colleague that some of us know called Mark Helgeson. He works for many years in Japan. And the article was in a little magazine called English Teaching Professional. And the article was called Encourage Students to Talk to Themselves. And he was being serious. He was saying, one of the things we can do in class is to do what anyone does when they're learning a foreign language. Forgive me for being personal, but I went to live in Mexico and I tried to learn Spanish. And what would I do as I walked towards a store where I wanted to buy something? I'd walk there, and in my head, I would try and work out what to say to the guy or the woman who was going to serve me. How do I ask for this? What do I say? What do I say if I'm going to the doctor? And that was the best Spanish language practice I ever had. So what I'm saying in teacher development and in teaching is just to remember how important silence is. Because silence, and all I'm doing is repeating what Peter said, to be honest. But I hope he will take that as flattery. What is it? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. All I'm saying is silence, the right kind of silence, is where we listen to other sounds. Now, John Cage was talking about physical sounds. But what you were talking about is a different kind of silence. It's the silence where we allow ourselves to think about what's going on. And that's really all I want to say. So I think the best thing I can do now is just to be silent.
Thank you, Jeremy. Or to quote William Shakespeare, the rest is silence. But it's not, because we have one more speaker, and it's Patrick Boylan, as I said you all know. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Patrick sincerely for what he's done to bring us all here to this wonderful conference, which I shall never forget, in this wonderful city. So thank you, Patrick, again and again. So I hand it over to Patrick as the last speaker on the panel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you to everyone in the room. And thank you to our panel. Before I begin, I'd like to thank all of these people. If I could just get a round of applause for all of their work, their writing, their vision. They've made a change in my life and a change in your life as well. I have the honor of being on this panel. I am not an author by any means. I've worked with a lot of you for many years, but one thing I think I do know, because I've had the honor of being a part of it, is institutional professional development. And I hope to share with you a little bit about that. I'm very much aware that my audience today includes members of the higher education community in Saudi Arabia, as well as the K through 12. So I'm hoping to share a little bit of some of the principles that we've developed here at the ELI over the past 5 years with some of our partners about institutional professional development, and today is an example of that. To begin with, there's a man I'm showing up on here on the stage. Does anyone have an idea of who this gentleman is? Because before 3 months ago, I didn't know, and unless you attended our talk yesterday, you wouldn't know either. My daughter has her hand raised. Do you know who he is, sweetheart? Yes? What's his name? Do you know? Okay, she doesn't know. This man has under management $141 billion. He runs the largest hedge fund in the history of the planet. His name is Ray Dalio. So his expertise in the area of advice is probably far superior than mine, of course, because people actually trust him with money. He has a theory that all decision-making can be deducted into a series of principles, that you could actually write down the way you think about things into a series of principles. You could turn that into an equation, and then you can feed that into a computer, and you can help it can allow you to help yourself make decisions. But he says the core thing before you begin any endeavor is to write down the principles. What are the things you believe in? What is the decision-making process that you go through? And share that with other people. First thing, though, you have to be able to take accountability. You have to be able to assess yourself as to where you are so you can decide where you're going. There's a great deal that you can learn from Ray Dalio. He gives away his ideas for free, as he should. He's worth one of the wealthiest people on the planet, so I don't think he needs any of our money. I recommend you look into him. But principles are important to me. So I'm going to go over with you today some of the principles that I believe are effective. Now, you can read all of the books from these people, and they're going to contain a lot of great ideas. I'm not sure all of the ideas I share today are going to be in their books. Hopefully, a couple of them are new. First one is carry your own weight. So you have to take responsibility to support with resources. Now, I'm not talking to you as individual teachers. I'm talking to you as institutions. We often think that professional development is a responsibility of the teacher, and it is. But it's also the responsibility of the institution. So for leaders here, for deans and vice deans, for department heads, for presidents, for people from organizations, use your resources to support your teachers. And today is an example of that. So use those resources, gather them together to support your teachers, and carry your own weight as an institution with the responsibility that you've been given and the resources you've been afforded to benefit the people in your community. Second thing is to be bold. Now, at one point in my career, in about 2009, I was sitting in a classroom and I was wondering what I was doing in this profession. I happened to pick up a book, as Peter said, that changed my life. Unfortunately, I can't say that it's one of your books. I have to be honest with you. The truth is, it was H.D. Brown's Teaching by Principles, which I think you're all aware of. And it did spur a CPD in my life. And one of the principles of language learning that he developed, or that he advocates, is that risk-taking is an essential part of learning. Well, risk-taking is an essential part of life. So you have to be bold. And we here at the ELI have been bold. And you see some of the pictures up here, an example of that. The ELI Symposium 2019 was a bold endeavor. It was only in May. It was less than a year ago. And here we are running what I believe to be the world's largest ELT conference in 2020. I don't think that's an understatement. And you see here some examples of that event from before. So take those risks as institutions, not as just individuals, but as institutions. Dean Abdullah, I'm looking to right now, so we've taken a lot of risks together, right? There's a lot of risks. There's a lot of risks that went into this event even today. Partnerships. Now, on this and on the back of your, I don't have one, on the back of your lanyard are a bunch of logos, right? There's a reason why these logos are there, because every institution up there we believe in. So find your partnerships. Collaborate with people that you believe in. We all are not a complete and total solution. We have over here Into Group, for example, a new partner that we have. They don't have all the solutions, but they have some that we can use. Cambridge University Press, Peter, and their organization, a whole bunch of solutions. You don't have all the solutions, but we can collaborate together. This event would not have been possible without all of these people. And some of the people at the bottom, I mean, and at the top, Microsoft, what are they? All of these people. Work together, find your partnerships, find people who believe in, again, as institutions. And also in your, I guess in your personal life as well. All right, so some people might notice their pictures up on the board here. Inspire. Help others see their potential. This is really important. So we have Naha al-Maliki over here, and we have Peter Lucantoni over here. And these two individuals have been a part of a trainer development program here at the ELI, which again, I think, highlighting our global leadership. I think we have the largest single cohort of trainer-the-trainer graduates, one of the Cambridge qualifications there, right? Yeah? Anywhere in the world. And these two people have single-handedly changed the lives of many of you I know in this room. That is as a result of institutional partnerships and institutional vision. That doesn't happen if the institutions don't get behind it. And I think that's something to be proud of. And you see some examples of some of our train-the-trainers there. It's wonderful to be a part of that process. All right, so for those of you who have ever worked with me, you'll know there's one thing that I love, and I love frameworks. I think frameworks are the core and key to almost any institutional development. So extend and expand your view of the world. Go deep into frameworks and higher level of competencies. As Tim was mentioning, there are initial qualifications you have to extend. So we have, I think, 100 Train the Trainer graduates, and Peter and myself, we had and along with Natla, had the benefit of even using this framework developed by Tom from Nile and Cambridge Assessment to really expand teacher development. We went beyond Train the Trainer. We went on to autonomous training, and now we're even going beyond. But frameworks will be your key as institutions. Today I'm going to be giving a talk about the principles of program development. Frameworks are the key to the principles of program development. They're essential. And they're a way that organizations such as Cambridge, such as Equals, such as Nile, give away their knowledge and expertise for us for free. They're not just there on a website to collect digital dust, but they actually have benefit and value, and I encourage you to use them. And that is the end of my talk. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. We have 30 minutes. I have a few questions I want to put to the panel, but if you have questions of your own, there are microphones available floating around, so I'll give you some wait time to prepare your questions. In the meantime, I just want to, a few of the takeaways that for me have made an impression on me on this panel. I have to say it's been a great pleasure, and it's been an illuminating experience listening to these speakers. Amanda's point, I think one of the points that I want to pick up on, perhaps later if we get a chance, is this notion of teacher variance. I think we take it for granted a little bit as trainers that all teachers are the same, and they're going to come in the same and go out the same. Of course, we know from experience that teachers vary enormously in quality, and it's a huge challenge, both at the training level, but also in the point of employment, and also it raises the question of how do we assess teacher effectiveness, which is maybe something we can discuss. And the other thing I want to take away from Amanda's presentation was the value of peer collaboration as opposed to kind of theory-driven models of teacher training and development. And I was quite impressed by that statistic of 95% effectiveness of peer collaboration, peer teaching, which is something that we really need to think about and how we build that into our training programs and our institutions. Tim followed on, and I think the point again he made that reiterated Amanda's point that teacher quality is the key variable in educational effectiveness. And this has been shown again and again around the world in global contexts. I was talking to somebody yesterday about the success that education has in countries like Finland. Is not to do with the amount of resources they pour into education necessary, not to do with the size of the classes, not to do with whether they do homework or not, but it's a lot to do with the teacher quality, the selection process of teachers, the training of teachers, the respect that teachers have in that society, and of course how much they're paid. So teacher quality is a key variable. And the other thing that Tim said, and I might like to pick up on this, is the importance of building on local capacity. And that's something I think we need to address, those of us who work, as it were, in the center, the traditional center of teacher education, linguistic research, etc., the so-called BANA countries, Britain, Australia, and North America. There is still a tendency, I think, to focus too much on the center as opposed to the periphery. Or to make the periphery the local center. And that's something I would like perhaps for us to address. But thank you, Tim, for raising that. Peter, it's wonderful to bring the teacher development back to one of the more traditional activities, reading and reflection on reading. And of course, I declare an interest here as being a series editor for the Cambridge Handbook series, of which your book on reading is one of the books I'm proudest to have edited. And I invite you to visit the Cambridge stand during the break to have a look at samples of the books from that series. But the importance of reading, of course, is very dear to me. And I would like to I've challenged the panel to think about the book that has most impacted on their teacher development. Patrick mentioned H. Douglas Brown's book, The Principles of... It's got principles in the title, yes. But H. Douglas Brown obviously had an impact on on Patrick's career trajectory, I'll just tell a story of my own. When I started teaching, those of you who know me know that I was teaching in Egypt. It was my first 5 years of teaching, in fact, and that was extraordinarily impactful. I had little access to literature, to reading texts in those days. There was no, apart from the British Council, there was no library that I had access to. And also, I didn't sort of at the time think that reading was that important. I'd done my CELTA, which had minimal reading on, I have to admit, in those days. And I was kind of running on just learning through experience. By chance, the institution I worked in had imported some copies of books from overseas, and one of them that I picked up and read, and this is literally the first book I read on teaching after 5 years of teaching, was a book by a man called Earl Stevick, who was an American educationist, sadly passed away 2 or 3 years ago, and he was very much active in the 70s and 80s in our field, and particularly came from a kind of what was called or is called a humanistic view of language teaching. Now, I had never really considered that language learning and language teaching is anything but a cognitive process. I was talking about this yesterday. I had assumed that language learning and learning to teach takes place solely in the brain, in the mind, as it were. What Earl Stevick, in his book A Way and Ways, proposed with the fact learning is a whole person process. It involves the whole person, not just the intellect, but your emotions, your experience, etc. Now, this was a hugely important discovery for me, and it really changed the way I taught. It changed the way I thought about teaching, and subsequently the way I did teach, and it has impacted on me ever since. So that's a book that I, as I say, made a huge impact on my teaching trajectory, and I'll invite the speakers to perhaps name a book of their own. Well, not a book that they have written themselves, but a book that they've read that might have influenced their career. And finally, well, not finally, and then of course Jeremy followed on nicely from Peter's point about reading and reflection to talk about the value of silence, not just the value of silence for teacher development, to reflect upon, and I'll invite you to reflect upon this panel after the session, but also the value of building silence into the teaching of languages. We tend to think of teaching as being a kind of a highly paced activity, a certain urgency to it, and a certain urgency is important, but there are times when it's important to break the pace and just let's stop, let's think, let's reflect. And as he says, it's a very important language practice activity, is thinking about what you're going to say, and I would also add thinking about what you have said. A lot of my experience of using Spanish as a second language in Spain, where I live, is thinking about, after an encounter, buying something or having a discussion or an argument, thinking, that's what I should have said. So the value of silence, I think, is very important. Thank you, Jeremy, for raising that. And then finally, Patrick's inspiring intervention. I think the point I would want to reiterate there is the importance of being bold and taking risks. And again, I think back on my own teaching experiences, when I took a risk, and those risks were often precipitated by something I'd read. So Earl Stevick's book, for example, they say, well, let's try doing something where it breaks the rules, to use John Fanslow's expression, breaking the rules that we were taught in our initial training. Let's see what happens when we don't follow those rules. And I remember going into a classroom in Egypt one time. I was a group of beginners students, but the students seemed to be very keen to speak, and the methodology that I was using with them didn't give them much room to speak. So I went into the class just to I think I'll just try to see what it is that they can do on their own without me. And I remember I put up on the board, I pinned up a picture of the then king of Saudi Arabia. We're talking about way back in the 80s. From Time magazine, there was a Time magazine piece about, I can't remember what it was about, but it involved Saudi Arabia, coincidentally, and I put up the picture of the king, and I sat down. And my students stared at the picture, and they stared at me, and they said, what's going on? And there was silence, this kind of silence that Jeremy was talking about. I didn't open my mouth. They looked at the picture, they looked at me. They were not used to this. They were expecting me to lead the lesson. And eventually, one by one, the students started to suggest words, phrases, etc., that were prompted by this picture from Time magazine on the board. And after a while, they gathered confidence, and between them, all 16 of them, they kind of constructed the story behind this news item and were able to then write it onto the board while I left the room. So again, complete silence on my part, but they were able to construct together, working collaboratively, the story behind this. And that was a thank you, Patrick, for reminding us all of the importance of taking risks. So I have a couple of other questions that teaching and also training. Those of you who are involved in online delivery of teacher training or teacher development, I wonder what you see as the advantages or disadvantages or challenges, let's say, of online delivery of teacher professional development. Anybody like to comment on that? Amanda.
I think there are both challenges and benefits. Let's start with some of the benefits. Linked to some of the things that the panel have been saying, you know, you get thinking time. It's flexible. You can do it at your own pace. Lots of opportunity for reflection. Thinking about the fact that variance in effectiveness of teachers is huge. Well, frankly, variance in effectiveness of teacher trainers and educators is huge. So online teacher training does give you access to some of the best teacher trainers in the world that you might not otherwise have access to. There are challenges, though, and I think it's across the piece with online learning. Motivation can sometimes be difficult. You can sometimes feel a bit isolated. And within professional development for teachers, if we're saying that collaboration with colleagues, thinking about it, talking about it, experimenting with it, you know, you maybe need to take that extra step if it's coming from an online source. Those are some thoughts from me.
A very quick story. About 12 years ago, or it may be more, I was invited to see if I wanted to become a tutor on an online MA program in the States. And the academic coordinator was the gentleman sitting on the end of so he was my boss, another boss. Well, this place is full of my bosses. Anyway, and I didn't want to do it, but I thought I should, because people were beginning to talk increasingly about training online. And if you are a teacher trainer, well, then you'd better have the experience. But one of the reasons I didn't want to do it was that I thought that the discussions that you have in a development session couldn't possibly be replicated online. And what I've learned is that I was profoundly wrong about that. That actually what we do at the new school is there are people who are studying the MA from different parts of the world in different time zones. Crucially, they are obliged to discuss regularly, and they're awarded a small grade ongoing throughout the course, which goes towards their final score for the module they're taking part in. And what happens is quite extraordinary, and it took me 2 or 3 years to realize it was happening, which is that someone posts an opinion, and because nobody replies to it immediately, we're back to silence again, because they're in a different time zone. They're in Vietnam, but the person who posted the thing is in New York or something. What happens is there's some time for thought. And then they come and post it, and then other people think and they post. And so the discussion, although it's not face-to-face, which is what my heart prefers, face-to-face discussion, of course, but the discussion can become really thoughtful and profound. That doesn't always happen, let's not exaggerate. We know perfectly well that sometimes it's kind of rubbish, but that's just life. But I discovered this fact, which I didn't believe beforehand, which was that online discussion, particularly if it's not synchronous, in other words, all at the same time, can be a really powerful way of exchanging opinion. So I don't know whether it's better or worse, but it is remarkably effective online in a way that I hadn't expected.
Yeah, could I just add to that? I think I agree that there are lots of advantages to online study, the things that Jeremy and Amanda have mentioned already. There are also other advantages, of course, about wider access. It makes things available much more widely. It can be more affordable in many cases than delivering face-to-face training. Many of our courses now are available as blended courses, so most of our courses we wouldn't do as online only, but in some sort of blend of face-to-face training and online training, and I think that really helps with the aspects like motivation, where people study partly online and then come together as a group for face-to-face training. Helps with that motivation, helps with that kind of discussion and reflection amongst the group. So I think that's an ideal situation really to compromise between the two.
Thank you, Tim. And a quick shout out. I know that Tom Kiddle from Nile will be doing a session on that very subject this afternoon. No? Tom at 2:20. Another issue that comes up that we haven't really touched on, but I think it's the elephant in the room, if you like, and a lot of this discussion about, especially about teacher effectiveness and teacher variance, is the assessment of teachers. You know, what is the best way and the fairest way of assessing teacher effectiveness? Does anybody want to risk putting their head on the block here? Patrick, and then Tim.
Because I'm often faced with this problem. We're faced with this problem as an institution. How do you balance the needs of the institution, people who work in your institution, and the quality assurance responsibility the institution has to make sure that people going into classrooms are actually delivering effective lessons, versus the need to treat these people as human beings who are on a journey of professional development, right? And so my advice to decision makers is to separate the two whenever possible. And unfortunately, there often isn't the resources to do that. But as much as humanly possible, you should separate the ranking of teachers, or the assurance that the people walking into that room are effective, to the degree that they're meeting minimum quality standards, and maybe do that as minimally as possible so you don't intimidate and hurt people. And then really put all your emphasis and focus on walking into classrooms as a mentor and an advisor and as a friend. Because at the end of the day, all of these people here show up to work and they really do want to be effective in the classroom, and they're deathly afraid that someone's going to come in and they're not going to get the 3 out of 4 stars because they had a bad day or their child was whatever for that day and they were preoccupied. So I think, again, from an institutional perspective, I'm sure everyone here has much more to say about it from an academic or from an advisor. From an institutional perspective, my advice is, please, as much as you can, relieve the pressure off of faculty members and teachers from feeling as though every time someone walks in the room, they might lose their job. That's all I'd have to say on that.
Yeah, I'd agree very much with what Patrick says. Before I was working at Cambridge, I was an academic manager. I worked in British Council, International House Schools, and there was always this tension between developmental observations, where you give constructive feedback to the teacher, work with them to identify areas they can develop, and the more assessment observations, which are about, they have to perform to a certain standard, and they do need to be very clearly separated. In some cases, there are questions, do you need those evaluative observations at all? There are lots of other ways that you can get that kind of feedback. You can have this mentoring relationship. The line manager or mentor of the teacher can work with them to identify how well they're doing. They can talk to the students, they get feedback from students. There are lots of ways that you can get a picture of how the teacher is performing without having to go in and do an evaluative observation. But it very much depends on what the institution decides to do, I'd say.
For me, avoid at all costs display lessons. Display lessons, which happens, when there is very little observation or drop-ins, formal or informal. So a teacher really does feel that this is my one chance in the year when I'm being observed. And they give a lesson which is frankly nothing to do with what they're doing day in, day out. They often don't perform well because it's not what they do day in, day out. The students are like, what is going on here? So I'm very much in favour of more frequent, more informal drop-ins, because what you want is to see truly what's happening day in and day out in the classroom. And peer observations, fantastic, I think, for the whole group of teachers being aware of the quality of what's going on and pinching ideas from each other. Yeah, it's difficult though, because there's fear involved, and that impacts performance. Take the focus on to what are the students doing, not what's the teacher doing. When you talk to a teacher afterwards about what the students were doing and the impact it has, you're not directly seeming to criticize them, you're asking them to think about it from the student perspective. That can help as well, I think.
Gosh, it's such a big question that we, if you've got all day, we could spend this. Something that always concerns me, and it's partly the fault of evaluations and exams schemes like the ones that some of you are involved with, which I don't want to criticize because there are reasons why they're there, and quality assurance is part of it. But one of the problems that always occurs to me is that when you have a checklist of lots and lots and lots of different things, you end up trying to evaluate every little micro detail of what a teacher does. But the really successful evaluation, especially if it's formative kind of assessment leading towards improvement, is not when you try and do everything, but when you try and do something or a couple of things. Because we're all capable of thinking about one or two things we might want to improve or work on or think about. It's much more difficult when you see 2 pages of things you should be doing. I think I'm agreeing with you actually in sort of massively, Amanda, and saying it'd be much more interesting if the evaluations were small and focused than large and kind of massive and hydra-headed.
Yeah, I would just sort of reiterate what Jeremy said. I think that if you have that checklist approach where teachers are confronted with a whole series of boxes that they feel they are expected to tick in every lesson, then you get exactly what Amanda described, which is a display lesson which tries to hit every box, and they feel they're being evaluated on little bits of the lesson, but no one's really evaluating overall. Did the students actually enjoy the lesson, and did they get anything out of it? Which should be the aim, really.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes.
Well, thank you very much for these interesting and engaging talks, and thank you for the nice insights from this beautiful session. It's not a question, it's just a comment. I'll come back to the question of Amanda about do teachers get better with experience? It's not about how long the experience is of this teacher. It's more about how much this teacher has learned and practiced different approaches of teaching. How much exposure this teacher has had to successful teaching experiences. How much this teacher reflects and thinks about their teaching. How much training they have got during their years of experience. And so overall learners' attainment relies on teachers' effectiveness. And in short, teacher autonomy helps a lot to enhance learner autonomy and to increase the learner's attainment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's an excellent summary. Any other points, questions? Our friend from Kosovo. Can we get a microphone? I ought to mention that, sorry, what was your name? That's right, we were talking yesterday. This is the first Kosovan I've ever met in my life, and it's great of you to have come all this way.
Thank you very much. I had a question for Amanda. Any useful tips that you could give us for what we should look for when we go and observe other teachers, for peer observation? Yeah, and one suggestion, Mr. Scott, please ask one question at a time, because you forgot to ask the question of a book title that they were supposed to suggest us, and I'm looking forward for that question to be answered. Thank you very much.
Tips for peer observation. I actually set up a working group in the British Council in Hong Kong when I was based there, with teachers and senior teachers, trying to open up the idea of observation to teachers. And we had in that group teachers, senior teachers, heads of teaching and learning. And we asked them, how can this work? And it depends on the environment that you're in, but one of the things that was quite successful, and it's to do with taking a risk, which Patrick mentioned, was to encourage teachers to actually ask for peer observations on something very specific, and they could actually upfront say, you know what, I'm really not that good at giving instructions in low level. Can somebody advise me of somebody else who's really good at that to come in and observe, a part of my lesson and then give me peer-to-peer feedback on how I can do it? So, in fact, picking something that you're not good at, or is not your strength, saying up front, I'm asking for support on this. This isn't a test where I'm going to show you I'm good. I'm saying I feel like I need some help. Come in, watch me, then have a little bit of discussion, and that person then goes and watch the person who observes them as well. So it works both ways. I think another thing with peer observation for people who are, and all observation in fact, for people who do have a barrier and a fear of it, is post-lesson observation. Doing an observation without actually being in the lesson, which is about the teacher talking about what happened. It's their reflection on what happened, which is actually one of the most important skills anyway. It's taken the pressure off of somebody actually being there, but when you are talking to a teacher and you're listening to them reflect themselves on what they did, you can sometimes feel that you were there. You listen to what they're saying and you can picture it. And it takes away some of the threat. Those are just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you, Amanda. We've only got a couple more minutes, so I'll address now the question and invite the panelists who haven't yet mentioned the book that most impacted on them in their professional development. So, Jeremy, you're not allowed to mention your own book.
Perfectly simple. Notional Syllabus is 1976, David Wilkins, because it suggested a new way of looking at the language we teach. And as a result, like people of my generation, I went straight towards Reading University for my master's to follow up. And that opened my, it's a bit like your experience, Patrick. It was the thing that kind of opened my mind to different ways of thinking about what we do in the classroom.
Mine's very easy. Il Sevic inspired me to give a talk called The Human Touch in a TESOL Spain, and impactful for every aspect of my life and interaction with other people, not just within the classroom. The human, that was the title of my talk, but yeah, his Humanism, a humanistic book.
I can't think of a single book actually that I'd recommend, unfortunately. I have to confess I haven't read many teaching-related books for quite a long time. So more recently I've read lots of blogs and things like Scott's A to Z blog and other things like along those lines, which have been very keeping up to date with what's current thinking is and the discussions around them.
I would go for a very practically oriented book. I think Davis and Rinvalukri's book in the Cambridge Handbooks for Language Teachers, Dictation, because I'd come from training which was actually sort of very regimented and sort of prescriptive, and it opened my eyes to sort of new ways of doing things in the classroom. So probably dictation would be one, and if I can quickly say another one, Dave Willis's book, Lexical Syllabuses, as well, just for its wonderful sort of argument and evidence base for new ways of looking at organizing a syllabus.
So actually, H.D. Brown wasn't the book that most impacted my professional career. It was and it wasn't really a book. It was the work of Equals's additions to the CFR, so the rebanding of the CFR from the plus levels, and the work, Tom from Equals and the vice chair, the work that Equals did with that, and so the CFR in general, Brian's work. So I think that had the greatest impact on me. It sort of framed for me in my career how we can shape language programs within a reasonably scientific measurement.
Thank you, Patrick. And on that note, I'd like to thank our illustrious panel. Can you give them a round of applause? And thank you all for staying with us. And that's the end of this panel. Thank you very much. And we have a break now? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Just real quick, before you leave, I almost forgot. I've been asked by Cambridge Press to remind everyone they brought some goodies. There are some signed books. You can get some signed books from Scott and from Peter Lucantoni by visiting the Cambridge booth, scanning the QR code, and you'll be entered in a draw. Please do that before 12:30. Thank you very much.